Always a pleasure, Joe. Thanks for coming.
Great to see you.
Let's straight jump in. Where is Ethereum at?
Where's Ethereum? Ethereum's everywhere. Look, Ethereum's out there, certainly on stage. Ethereum's going to be a long-term evolution. It's amazing where it's come from, or how far it's come, considering it was just an idea a very short number of years ago. I think we're in a great phase right now where we're working on scalability, we're working on privacy and confidentiality in private contexts and in public contexts, doing really great breakthrough work on usability, on UI and UX, and that all said, people keep saying that we need scalability in order to do useful and important things. We've basically built this trust foundation for the planet, which will enable us to re-architect systems over the next years and decades. But even now, we're essentially building out the financial plumbing for the the emerging decentralized economy. You're all seeing it. It's decentralized commerce and decentralized and open finance, and most of that's getting built on Ethereum. And we actually don't need tremendous scalability in order to make prediction markets and payment systems and lending, borrowing really relevant.
Let me jump there in, because there are already a lot of things to unpack or to go deeper on. So one criticism I hear about Ethereum is that the narrative changed, and I personally don't see this as an issue at all. I think it's a little bit probably coming from the Bitcoin world, because in my view, kind of the core of Bitcoin is a narrative. So I sometimes call it a meme coin. So it's this idea of 21 million, and then really kind of what guarantees this is a strong narrative about this idea of this concept of 21 million limited supply. So with Ethereum, probably one of the first ways to describe it was this world computer, and then some people have argued, well, it's maybe not. So now you said the word trust anchor or trust settlement or
trust foundation.
Trust foundation, right? So do you think that's currently
well, I hope the narrative keeps changing.
Right.
I think it is a characteristic of many people, maybe most people, that they prefer static things. They prefer to think linearly. It's much less complicated to live in a world that doesn't change, but that's a boring world, and that's not the world we actually live in. So I think it's great that the Bitcoin narrative is evolving as the Bitcoin ecosystem evolves in the context of a bigger ecosystem that's evolving, and I think the narrative around Ethereum has evolved so much more dramatically, and I think we knew from the start that we were essentially building an incredibly complicated machine, but that it was ultimately really a toy, a proof of concept, Ethereum 1.0, a very sophisticated proof of concept that would enable us to understand what decentralized applications are and what wrapping companies around decentralized applications would be, and what decentralized organizations are, and decentralized identity. And so I think we are moving in so many directions really rapidly and building out the decentralized economy. So I think it's moving beautifully.
On this idea of a trust anchor, how?
So why do I think it's a trust anchor, or why do I think that's a useful narrative?
Oh, well, no, that's, so how far are we there? So,
sure.
So, for example, do you expect...
I think we're there conceptually.
And what do you think does it take, for example, for a central bank to decide we want to issue our money on Ethereum?
Sure, so let me get back to the question that you asked before. So the world has been constructed out of necessity, organized via top-down command and control hierarchical systems. It's out of necessity because communication and decision-making has been slow and expensive, but we're much better at instantaneous communication, and Bitcoin and Ethereum have enabled large collectives to make decisions within a very short period of time, and so that changes the organizing principle. Hierarchies are great in some ways and really bad in other ways. Flat, fluid, decentralized systems have lots of advantages. We can go into that if you want. But forever, basically, we've been dependent on trust systems that were centralized and subjective, and now we have this automated trust system or this objective trust system, and it's not a big, high throughput trust system right now. I think you were the first person I ever heard call it a Supreme Court, essentially, so we can think of, especially as we move into Ethereum 2.0, where we have the beacon chain, we can think of this base trust layer as being the final arbiter. I also call it a global settlement layer sometimes, and we shouldn't be looking to have the Supreme Court arbitrate between our little disputes that you and I might have, but when we escalate certain situations or create really efficient ways to use that base trust foundation, it's going to be a much more equitable judicial and execution system for the planet. And so it's there, it's usable, we need to scale it.
Maybe on that route, I wasn't necessarily intending to go there, but because you mentioned it, this idea of a Supreme Court for the planet or something like that, I think to some extent we are seeing currently a divide between China, or like the eastern part of the world, and the western part of the world, and like trade wars, and to some extent those parts trying to isolate from each other. Do you see kind of a role for Ethereum there, or do you think that should be an explicit goal to?
I actually do. So we do a lot of work in supply chain, so it's data provenance, it's tracking of materials, it's trade finance, it's factoring of invoices. The really interesting aspect of that is that these are trust systems. Even with trust systems, if you put garbage in, you get garbage out. But we're moving into a phase in which devices are going to have their own identity sitting in secure enclaves, and they'll be able to sign transactions. And so if you can be certain that a sensor has a tested identity, and if it's calibrated, and you can be sure that it's spitting out correct information as much as possible, you can move that into a blockchain system, and the provenance of that data can be as good as we've ever had in human history. And so we are seeing a bifurcation in supply chains right now between the West and the East a little bit. They're not really bifurcated, but there's danger of significant bifurcation. And so I do feel like these automated trust systems may be able to enable us to remain entangled or to stay connected because we can trust the technology. We're still going to have to verify and scrutinize the hardware and software implementations carefully, but I do think that we can have different political systems and disputes while trusting that these systems just operate, and we can take that as a foundational common good that even if we disagree on everything, we still are dependent on that and accept that. Should I jump into the central bank question that you asked before?
Yeah, or maybe,
you're on to the next thing?
Maybe kind of, no, we stay there. So I saw, obviously followed Libra, and I guess they have some similar goals, I assume, maybe?
Words.
Okay, similar words. But one thing is, looked at the list of companies that were involved or are maybe involved there and so on, and it was basically all US companies. So I felt like to be that global settlement layer or this global trust anchor, you probably want to have something that's more global. And kind of back to this East-West thing, do you think Ethereum is global enough? I mean, I would say there is still a Western heavy bias in Ethereum.
Probably true. So, with respect to Libra, I was actually excited about the project for various reasons. I don't philosophically believe that we should be part of that project, but many projects like that will exist. Some of them, Signature Bank and True Digital are running one right now. JP Morgan's moving to run one. The Libra Foundation, they're perfectly within their rights. It gets a little dangerous if Facebook with 2.3 billion citizens is a big part of that. So there's a lot that society needs to think through before it allows Facebook to have more understanding of 2.3 billion people and control over 2.3 billion people. But so I definitely support those kinds of systems, and they don't have to be maximally decentralized. They can just serve their customers. I don't think of those systems as a base trust layer, and I don't think of those systems as a global settlement layer. Local, regional settlement layer, but in order for us to have a trust foundation and a global settlement layer, we need a project that is assiduously focused on maximal decentralization in every dimension that we can articulate. And so there are very few projects like that on the planet, and I think Ethereum is one of those projects. It's not nearly as decentralized as we need it to be, but we just need to keep pushing in that direction. It, I think, is in the lead, but still has to earn the right to be a base settlement layer.
Yeah, so I guess in a very similar direction, I thought kind of ideally Ethereum would be in a place that it would be the obvious choice to issue a currency like Libra, because I mean it's obviously two things. So there's kind of the currency or the token, and there's the blockchain. And in my view, ideally Ethereum would be in a position that it would just be the obvious thing to do it on Ethereum. Like when Facebook started, Facebook started, it was the obvious thing to do it on the internet. I mean, they did.
So Ethereum did issue a token like that. It's called Make or Die. Ethereum, the foundation, and the project, that wasn't really in the purview of that project.
Oh no, I agree. But I still think, or I would ask you if you agree. I think if Ethereum would be even further in its role of being decentralized and being this settlement layer, it would be just the obvious choice to issue. Libra would issue this token just on Ethereum without even thinking about it. Like people now, of course, they use the internet and they don't even think about should they use their own private network or should they use this public, global, accessible, decentralized thing.
So there are a bunch of price-stable tokens on Ethereum. And they're pretty heavily used, and they'll be more and more heavily used. You're using them for sight, and they significantly undergird lots of the activity on the Ethereum platform. What I think is going to happen is one will emerge dominant, but even more likely, there will be another layer that sits on top and makers even trying to do this themselves, really, to put other assets underneath, do multi-collateral DAI. And so I think that has the potential to be more stable, especially if it's actively managed. If you've got 5 price-stable tokens tracking the US dollar as your underlying over a layer 2 coin, basically, I think that's, and there can be competing versions of that, I think that's going to be the position to be in. And I think that's a coin that many would trust, and we'll see. It'll be an interesting competition.
You mentioned earlier Ethereum is kind of pretty decentralized, but not enough. So decentralization is, well, it's definitely very multi-dimensional thing. So what are specific things that need to be, like, or what is part of it? So what do you think needs to be addressed, and what are practical things, how it can get more decentralized?
So I guess we could try to enumerate some dimensions. Number of nodes, number of distinct owners of the nodes, the number of developers, the number of clients, the jurisdictions in which those people reside, the power grids in which all the different nodes are sitting. So we could probably list,
So
list a handful.
on what of those, or where do you see kind of the biggest need for Ethereum to further decentralize on kind of those?
So governance is a really good one also. I personally prefer what Ethereum is doing with governance over what Tezos, Dfinity, and Decred, and Polkadot are doing or are going to do. I think, so very, very early on the Ethereum project, we planned to put some governance in smart contracts. We hoped that we would build infrastructure and build some of the governance into Ethereum, and governance is really hard. And I think that there are lots of different classes of actors in the Ethereum ecosystem that have significant voice, and so I think it's going well for such a young ecosystem. I would be concerned about codifying governance into the protocol this early, and I'm concerned that some projects will take advantage. So Dan Larimer, a long time ago, noticed that, hey, all these people are speculators and they love buying tokens, but they don't bother to show up to vote for anything. So he went ahead and he built a system that required everybody to vote for everything, but they made some modifications so that they would be able to delegate votes, and maybe that works a little bit better. But I think some of these protocols will end up with VCs and founders being the ones who are de facto or by default in control. So I am impressed, let's say, with how governance is going in the Ethereum ecosystem. I think it would be great to have more inexpensive hardware devices. So maybe max decentralization along that dimension is if everybody on the planet runs their own staking node for Ethereum 2.0. And max would be that everybody has, say, 32 Ether staked. That's not going to happen. Or some equal amount of Ether staked. And so we actually have a project within Consensus to basically create a very inexpensive device that you can just plug into the wall and be a full node on Ethereum. And so I'd love to see more of that happen.
Would you agree that eventually changes or like the need for governance would go down, or kind of the system would like just stabilize, or at some point it's so the users are so diverse that you will probably then never agree to any changes anymore?
Yeah, so I think Vitalik has expressed that he's very interested in getting to a point with respect to scalability and other aspects at layer 1 of Ethereum so that it really doesn't change that much, and so you would need much less governance at that level. At that point, you've got many different kinds of systems at layer 2 or layers higher than that, and they can have their own unique or idiosyncratic governance. So yes, I do think that's going to happen.
And we can finally come back to the question with the central bank. So what do you think? I mean, I know that different central banks have looked into this already, have looked into, well, either creating a token on Ethereum or creating a token on their own blockchain or something like that. what would you say to them? Is Ethereum ready for that? And if not, when? And do you expect it to happen?
Yeah, so Ethereum mainnet is not ready for that. The Ethereum technology is definitely ready for that. We did work with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, built a real-time gross settlement system there. We did a much more sophisticated project with the South African Reserve Bank, Project Coca, where we built a better real-time gross settlement system. That central bank was interested in building infrastructure that didn't have them as a single point of failure or vulnerability or control. And so that system enabled, I think it was 5 different banks to do all of their daily transactions. It all got processed in 2 hours and with full privacy and confidentiality, netting system, so it netted out all the transactions as it should. So the technology is being explored by central banks. In a different nation, we were asked to discuss or propose how they might issue a central bank currency. And one idea that we proposed was just to set up a payment system between the different departments of the government, and from there enable companies to get on the system, and from there enable the people to get on the system. So that's one path forward potentially. I don't see any major nations doing that anytime soon. There's talk of China building their own cryptocurrency. I am skeptical that that'll happen in the next few years. And it's not the technological issue, it's just political will, and these are super complicated use cases, and you can't get it wrong.
Yeah, I guess there's a lighter barrier to entry. I mean, it doesn't have to be the only place where you issue. You could just like start with a small amount, or start to. I think there in Iceland there is this.
So in Iceland, we've been involved with that project for a long time, and we're one of the investors in that project.
Right.
One of the discussions that we had early on, and Iceland got into a lot of trouble because of. They issued too much money and it all came flooding back in the financial crisis. And so what if Iceland creates a state-issued currency that gets incredibly popular globally? You're carrying it, I'm carrying it. It doesn't become the reserve currency for the world, but it gets well utilized, and they choose to issue a little bit too much of it or a lot too much of it. And then if something happens that give people pause, or if they feel that there's some sort of risk by some sort of event in Iceland, all those tokens could come sloshing back onshore and just destroy the economy there. I guess they could figure out how to sop them all up, but they're complicated issues to deal with.
Then maybe let's move to a little bit to DeFi. Have you used any DeFi personally?
I have not, no.
Sorry? No.
I mean, I look at it, but
right.
I don't have time to play with it too much.
All right, but
I look at DeFi Pulse a lot, and I'm aware.
Okay, but is there stuff you like, or you think?
Yeah, sure, of course.
So.
It's a really exciting space. Maker's been great for a long time. I like Compound a lot. I like the idea of a sort of money market infrastructure. I like prediction markets.
Right. So then on that, I think Maker is it's somewhat similar to the question of whether or not central banks will issue tokens or money on Ethereum. We had, of course, this first token wave, but for something to Maker, for something as Maker, or like many of the other DeFi things to really be useful, there needs to be a lot more of stuff collateralized or tokenized. And be accessible on Ethereum. So Another topic that has been, of course, also discussed quite a few times are security tokens, or like just in general, more financial products, more traditional financial products being replicated on Ethereum. So what is the state there, and what do you expect to see?
So we at ConsenSys have done lots of launching of utility tokens and some launching of tokenized securities, and we're tooled up to do a lot of that very soon. And so I think that's going to be a very important next wave going forward. In the United States in particular, there's one piece that regulators aren't really comfortable with, and that's custody. So there's secondary market trading, which has not really worked out yet, but it's basically custody of these assets that has to get worked out more to enable the regulators to get comfortable. And there are some projects that I'm very aware of that we hope will give regulators real comfort. At some point, the floodgates will open because there's a lot of pent-up demand out there. We just have to get everybody comfortable.
Do you think that will happen in the US or in Europe, Germany, Switzerland? Both Germany and Switzerland had quite some interesting news around making it possible or allowing type of security tokens. So other jurisdictions maybe?
Yeah, so it'll definitely happen in all of those jurisdictions. I was specifically talking about the American regulators. Singapore's pretty gung-ho. We worked with our partners, CapBridge, to build an exchange in Singapore for private equity. It is live. It runs on a platform called Ethereum, public mainnet, not a private implementation, and it's regulated by the Monetary Authority of Singapore. So we actually have pretty serious crossover from the regulated world into public mainnet blockchain.
If you go this route, often it comes with some form of, additional requirements around KYC, AML. How do you see the tension of, do you lose then advantages of what initially the idea or the promise was of an open global system?
We're not throwing out utility tokens. We are we remain extremely excited about utility tokens, and we will launch utility token networks that will not be seen as securities by any regulator. Well, that's not true. By the regulator in the United States, at least. It's really important to understand that consumer
utility token and security
consumer
token,
utility token.
Is this differentiation just about one that's really transferable and the other that's not, or
no, not at all. No, utility tokens can have lots of the characteristics of security tokens, but there shouldn't be an issuance in enormous quantities to speculators, and the issuance should be to people who are pledged to use it or constrained to use it in some way. So we're often calling them consumer utility tokens. So TrueSet is a good example. We ran an experiment with the TrueSet protocol where people are incentivized to upload information on token launch projects and correct information on token launch projects, and they're awarded tokens in various different circumstances. And that's a clean utility token. And we are likely to, I won't say anything, but that's the kind of project that we are confident can be launched in the United States and not be seen as a tokenized security.
I was super excited to learn about actually a German project. I wasn't really aware before and wasn't really involved, but it's called Fundament Token or something like that. I don't even know. But the exciting thing about it is...
Real estate one?
Yeah,
Real estate.
it's a
The
real
bond?
estate bond, exactly. But the exciting part about it is that it is, or that apparently they can issue it as a pure ERC20 token that can freely be transferred, and basically a bearer bond.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. Right. So if Ethereum fails, why?
If Ethereum fails, why? Ethereum won't fail.
Okay, that was easy.
Ethereum is massively decentralized, extremely useful, growing incredibly quickly, and anti-fragile. So whatever you throw at Ethereum will make it stronger. I'm not sure how it fails in that context.
Right.
Maybe if you're too nice to it.
What makes Ether valuable?
Utility. It is required for storage and computation on the network, and also lots of people believe that it will be more and more in demand. So speculation as well.
Yeah, so I mean on this, well, there are a lot of discussion whether that's the case, whether it is required. So I'm kind of the personal opinion the fee model needs to change. So to actually make it required, because right now in theory you can, well,
in theory that is correct for right now. It won't be correct for Ethereum 2.0,
right.
And there's likely to be burning of Ether. So absolutely, it seems silly to me that Dan Shapiro, there's a bunch of discussion a while ago that the Ethereum token should have no intrinsic value, or there should be no need for it to be on the platform. But we've seen more rational discussion recently that these tokens represent the security of the platform and incentive for people to continue to build the platform. So early on, we didn't talk about the monetary aspects of Ether for legal reasons and other reasons. We wanted to focus on the developer ethos. But yeah, it's important to have the undergirding token be very strong and yes, a focus with respect to security and attention for the ecosystem.
How's Consensus doing?
Pretty great. So we are sort of moving to a point of convergence internally, where I've been trying to get lots of projects to work together for a long time with lots of success, but you know, they were sort of figuring their own stuff out and maturing their own products. And now we have our commerce and decentralized finance group working with the Infura group, working with the Pegasus Pantheon group, working with the Alethio Analytics group, working with MythX security contract audit. And so things are starting to come together as a much more integrated consensus ecosystem.
And kind of, so probably this offering that you can then create, which companies or whom are you addressing with this offering?
Who are we addressing?
Yes.
So a couple of...
Who are your customers then?
A couple of major focuses. One, Web3 developers. Two, the commerce, DeFi, OpenFi space, token launches, et cetera. We do work with major institutions, so we've built Liquid Shares in France. It's an exchange, and the exchange in Singapore, and Comgo, a commodities trade finance network that took about 6 months to build with some major energy companies and major banks, and it went live in December. So we're all over the map, from the individual developer to startups in our space to major organizations.
All right, so I think I would open it up for the audience. Yeah, please.
Thanks for the comments. Really enjoyed it. Clearly, a big kind of overall issue and problem for cryptocurrency generally, Ethereum specifically, is getting mass usage. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you may have commented that you hadn't or you don't use DeFi. I'm interested in what you do use on Ethereum and why you use it.
Well, we make payments on Ethereum, and we build applications on Ethereum. So the many people at Consensus are using it and building it every day.
There, I think over there.
I'm curious, Joe, what you think of the, you used the term utility token before. I'm curious whether you think that that's a term that people will use in 5 or 10 years, or if you think that's an artifact of basically a securities law analysis that perhaps ultimately won't be useful.
Yeah, it seems likely that token will just be used, and it seems likely that a tokenized security will be called a share. I think we'll probably go back to the common language.
Then maybe like just one follow-up question.
But I think it's important when you develop a new technology and you're trying to negotiate how it fits in society, we need to use perhaps somewhat embellished or awkward language to point out the differences in the new scheme.
Just maybe then one follow-up here. So obviously there was the ICO boom in 2017, and certainly there were, I mean, certainly kind of the concept to some extent got burned, I would say.
The ICO concept?
Well, I mean, or at least there is, or what is the positive view on or what is kind of the positive narrative on
ICOs?
On utility tokens?
Well, I think we're going to build better and better systems. We're going to build these collaboration networks that require some sort of membership or stakeholdership, and tokens do a good job of mediating that. And whether it's voting or different rights to occupy different roles on a music industry platform or a journalism platform, I think we can, it's software, we can make it do what we want it to do, and we can call lots of different things tokens. And so the Civil project is a good example. The Civil project is working pretty well right now. It's a project for ethical and sustainable journalism. It has, I think, 60 or so newsrooms on the platform. It's got a constitution, and newsrooms apply to be part of the platform, to get that sort of civil stamp, and to be part of the community. And the audience of these newsrooms can accept them on the platform, and they can also monitor their behavior for ethical violations. And the system is working in that there are challenges, and projects are getting refused entry on the platform. There was one 2 weeks ago that was resoundingly refused entry because it was really a Bitcoin PR firm rather than a newsroom. So there have been several challenges, and the participation has been really quite high, amazingly. And these tokens also enable people to evolve the minimum viable constitution that was put out. So I mean, that's a great use of a token, I think.
Hi. How do you see Infura changing to facilitate for Ethereum 2.0?
So Infura's a great resource. We are dedicated to decentralization. We're also dedicated to building out the Ethereum ecosystem and making it easy for developers to do what they need to do and not have transactions dropped on the ground. Infura may stay where it is and serve a certain subset of the use cases that need it. and Infura has been paid in the past, and they just offered their Infura Plus service, and people are signing up because it just makes things easier, and they do a great job. Really brilliant infrastructure. At the same time, there'll be so many use cases and like clients that just don't need that sort of responsiveness or reliability. So that's one path forward, that it serves some segments of the ecosystem. Similar to how Cloudflare serves some segments of traffic on the internet. The other path forward that we've been thinking about for a couple of years and had different kinds of plans is to figure out ways to decentralize Infura itself and bring in many more actors to either have governance over the infrastructure, or we can package up different nodes that others can run in their own infrastructure. So like everything at Consensus, which is a pretty decentralized mesh of different projects, the team makes its own decisions. So I have some input into it, but they make their own choices.
Hi, here. How do you see the future stability of Ethereum in terms of potential hard forks and competition from other chains? Like, is it safe to build something that has to last for like 5 or 10 years on Ethereum right now?
Future stability of Ethereum in the context of possible hard forks.
As well as competitors.
As well as competitors, okay. I believe Ethereum is incredibly stable. I believe that we're going to transition to Ethereum 2 in a very smooth manner. I believe that Ethereum 1 is going to probably run for a pretty long time, even while Ethereum 2 boots itself and interoperates with Ethereum 1 and then begins life in full as the 3 or 4 phases of Ethereum 2 get completed. So I'm not worried about hard forks making it difficult to have persistent applications, and I'm not worried about competition making it difficult. If a tremendous project came into existence right now that was 10x or 100x better than Ethereum, and I don't see one right now, but if that happened, I still think that Ethereum would be very significant 10 years from now, and that it will subserve many different use cases, even if for some reason it slowed in its development and was no longer cutting edge. I really don't see that happening. I see Ethereum moving faster than any other project in the space. Ethereum's superpower, as Ben Edgington wrote once or many times, is its decentralization, is its open source bazaar approach. We see problems pop up and people show up, enter the ecosystem to address those problems. We've got a lot of teams right now within Consensus working on Ethereum 2, and a lot of teams outside of Consensus working on Ethereum 2. So lots of stability and lots of dynamicism.
Last 2 questions.
Hey there. You mentioned that Consensus has been working with a lot of quite a few enterprises and institutions quite recently, and I was wondering, how do you go about communicating the value of Ethereum and blockchain in general without scaring them of the technical complexities of the matter? How do you persuade them into the value of the blockchain?
So we've been talking to institutions for a long time. About 6 months into the existence of Consensus, we started getting calls because people were hearing about Ethereum, and there were people in different financial institutions, one of them sitting in the front here, that became aware. And so there were these early adopters in lots of institutions, and they really got the discussion going in those institutions, and then we were in the right place to field lots of those calls. So for a long time, back then, 2015, 2016, we were happy to talk to anybody about Ethereum and did a lot of education and little advisory work and eventually POCs. Back then, banks and energy companies and insurance companies, et cetera, were all very naive. There was one person who was kind of the blockchain person there. Actually, they were called the Bitcoin person back then. And they were the crazy people who finally got their colleagues to pay attention. And so we would have meetings with these organizations. They'd come to our office in Brooklyn, New York. We had 11 people from the Federal Reserve of New York walk down the streets of this hipster area in Brooklyn in their suits, and they just weren't very savvy. So we've had long-running relationships with lots of those organizations and done a huge amount to educate and foster different kinds of adoption. And a year later, there were much more sophisticated teams inside those groups. Now, every major financial institution has an extremely sophisticated understanding of the technology. A lot of them, probably the majority of them, are more focused on the Ethereum technology. Lots of them are, basically all the others are focused on Fabric or R3 Corda.
Last question, if there is another question. Oh yeah, yeah, I think there, over there. Can you maybe just raise your hand again? Oh, okay, that's coming.
Thank you. Consensus is in the middle of many different developments. How do you personally stay focused and relaxed with all these things across different time zones and whatnot?
I don't know. It's exciting and important, and I work with really incredible people at Consensus. It's definitely, it gets intense, and we may have an argument or two, and we may have some people that don't do well according to certain other people, but that's pretty rare. It's just a great situation to be part of, and people in this room, people in this ecosystem are in it for pretty deep philosophical reasons. And so that kind of passionate is very strong at Consensus, and it's really rewarding. Not many people get to be like everybody in this room, in the forefront, in the early stages of a major societal evolution or revolution. So I really don't get tired of it.
That is a perfect kind of segue to a panel we will have at 5. So at 5 we will talk about, also with Vitalik, a panel about kind of how hopefully Ethereum will change society in 10, 20 years. But for now we are over. Thanks a lot, Joe, and well, have a good break.